Figures leaked to The Spectator this week show that despite a £12 billion cash injection, more than 9 million people could be on an NHS waiting list by 2024. What's gone so wrong? I'm joined now by Chris Hopson, the CEO of NHS Providers. Chris, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. Now, this Tuesday in the House of Commons, the Health Secretary Sajid Javid laid out his elective recovery plan, and this is supposedly the parameters for how and in what time frame we're going to tackle the NHS backlog that's been made significantly worse by COVID-19 and the subsequent lockdowns. The waitlist was at a record high 4.4 million pre-pandemic. It's now around 6 million and is estimated to skyrocket further. What do you make of all this?
Well, it's a very important moment for the NHS. I mean, everybody in the NHS knows that it's to start in the right place for me, which is with the patients, which is we know because of COVID, but also, yes, you're right, the waiting lists were increasing before we went into COVID. We do have far too many patients who are having to wait too long for treatment, and we absolutely know that that potentially has a really serious impact. There are people who are living in pain. There are people who, if we can't treat them quick enough, do risk having their conditions worsen and become permanently worse. So there's a real understanding in the NHS that we need to get through these backlogs absolutely as quickly as possible. We also have been waiting for this plan. We did a lot of work on it before Christmas. It's now been finalised and is ready to go. And that it indicates to us how the money is going to be spent, but it also sets out very clearly some more detailed targets that we had when the money was first announced about exactly what people can expect for this extra investment that the money is putting, that the government is putting in.
Some figures were held back, though. So Javid said in the House of Commons that by March 2024, that wait list would peak and start to fall. But he stressed that in the meantime, the wait list was going to rise. And by how much has been that question that nobody seems to want to answer. The Spectator in the magazine this week does start to try to answer that question, revealing classified NHS modelling used to come up with that date. And it shows a peak of 9.2 million on the NHS waiting list by March 2024, and that's in the optimistic scenario. That's expected or forecast to fall to 8.5 million by March 2025. So that would be a new national insurance levy, billions more for the NHS to take us to a wait list in 3 years' time. That's actually 2 million higher than where we are now. Is that really good value for money?
Well, I think if you don't mind, I'll challenge the word nobody wants to answer what the waiting list might look like. The reason we can't answer what the size of the waiting list looks like is because it depends upon the number of people who didn't come forward for treatment during COVID, how many of those actually come forward. And I've been tweeting over the last couple of days to say one of the problems the NHS faces is that we can be hopefully relatively clear about the volume of activity we can get through, which is why when the money was first announced, we made a very stretching commitment that we would have around 130% of activity compared to pre-COVID levels would be delivered by 24-25. But the bit that's really difficult for us is being clear about how quickly we can get through the waiting list, because we simply don't know how many extra patients are going to come forward. And what we don't want to do is we don't want to make commitments that we can't deliver, because then everybody will jump on us and say, hey, look, you promised you would deliver this by a certain date and you haven't. And we also, to be frank, we don't want to let patients down. We want to be very clear about what the expectation for patients should be, and that when we make those commitments, we know we must deliver them, because otherwise patients are going to be led down the garden path in a way that's inappropriate. So it's not because the NHS is foot dragging. It's not because that we kind of don't want to make commitments. It's not because we don't want to answer questions. It's not because there's private secret modelling that we're not revealing. It's basically because this is a very uncertain situation, and we feel it's right to play it fair for our patients, play it fair for our staff by only making commitments that we know are deliverable. They're stretching ambitions that we've now announced yesterday, earlier on this week, but we know they're deliverable.
So as you say, nobody has a crystal ball, of course, and forecasts aren't perfect predictions. When the information changes, you often have to change the forecast, and we don't know how many people are going to be coming forward. And you also say you don't want to get expectations higher for patients who, of course, have been waiting a long time. And that's very understandable. But the truth is there are forecasts being done. There are NHS models that the NHS has access to, the Department of Health has access to, that were deliberately not announced by the NHS or by politicians. Because that data, the 9.2 million peak, the 8.5 million by 2025, it isn't pretty. I can totally appreciate not wanting to heighten expectations, but don't you think that we should level with the public, be honest with the public, especially as their tax money is going up? They're going to expect to get better results. And the very difficult truth is that things are going to look worse in 3 years' time than they look right now. I mean, don't you think the public at least deserve to know that?
Well, Kate, you can't say that things will definitely look worse in 3 years' time because we absolutely don't know the answer to that question. What we can absolutely say, and of course you're right, this is a taxpayer-funded system. It is quite rightly led by politicians who have to account in the House of Commons for how that money is spent. And of course, all of our trust leaders are absolutely focused on delivering value for money because they know that this is taxpayers' money and that they should be held accountable for how much they deliver for that money. And that's precisely why we have made these much more detailed commitments than were made in the initial announcement, where, as I said, we committed to a level of elective activity around 130% by 24-25, while we've done more work to try and give patients a clearer indication with a degree of specificity, for example, breaking out cancer, about when they can expect to be treated, because that's part of being held accountable. I just, the bit that, if I'm honest, Kate, I found difficult about the article that you wrote is the sort of implication that sits behind it, that somehow NHS trust leaders are kind of seeking to evade accountability. They're seeking to hide information. They're seeking to effectively, as I said, be dragged into setting an ambitious target. Nothing could be further from the truth. Every single trust chief executive that I talk to is really clear about the moral imperative here about treating these backlogs as quickly as they possibly can, because day in, day out, they are talking to patients and they are seeing patients who are in pain. So they are going absolutely as fast as they can, and they're absolutely stretching as far as they can to meet these targets. But they also, quite rightly, are saying they have to be deliverable. So I don't quite see this picture of somehow a reluctant NHS being dragged into making commitments, when actually it's those trust leaders who want to make as stretching a commitments as possible, because they know the impact on patients if they don't make those commitments.
Well, I don't at all pretend to know what's in the hearts of the NHS officials who are negotiating this. Just looking at the details of what was once thought to be agreed, at least on the political side, was that if you go back to summer 2021, there was modeling coming out from the Department of Health showing that hopefully by 2025 you would have a wait list that was closer to 5.5 million based on the tax rise, the substantial manifesto-breaking tax rise that politicians were considering. And somehow you get just a few months down the road, and that's gone up by millions, and the situation 3 years' time is forecast to look a lot worse than it does now. And I know that that information wasn't wanted in the public domain. So again, it's very reasonable to say that, you think the NHS is doing its best. It's reasonable to say that we don't want to make promises we're not sure we can keep. But this elective recovery plan has been based off these models, based off this time frame, which has not been published. And again, as you point out, for the patients who are in pain, who are suffering, many who are going to really struggle until they get access to some of the selective care that they need, shouldn't they have a reasonable idea of the time frame that the NHS is looking at behind closed doors? Shouldn't that be opened so that the patients themselves at least know what the NHS and this recovery plan is based off of, their assumptions at the moment, even if those assumptions change, because of course that can be updated?
Well, again, I'm afraid I don't quite recognise the narrative here in terms of, and I've spoken to the people who on the NHS side have been doing the detailed discussions, and where we were was that, exactly as you say, last at the point last September-ish, whenever the government made their announcement around the extra money for the NHS, we did a lot of careful work to agree a specific top-level activity target around 130% of pre-COVID elective activity. The work that we've then been doing since is exactly what you just said we're keen to avoid, which is actually to how do you turn that into some commitments for patients? Because we know that patients aren't interested about how much activity the NHS is getting through. What they want to know is when are they going to get their treatment? And that's precisely why earlier on this week we announced a set of detailed, and they are very stretching, they are challenging ambitions, but the crucial bit is we know that they're deliverable. And so I just don't recognise, and neither do the people who've been working on this from the NHS side, recognise a narrative that says that we've been trying to hide things. There have been kind of sort of secret pieces of analysis done that haven't been put in the public domain. What we've put in the public domain is rightly what we should have done, which is stretching, deliverable, ambitious, but clear targets about when people can expect to be treated.
Well, the forecasts are now in the public domain. You can read about them in the Spectator magazine this week, and I suppose the public can make up their minds as to whether or not they thought that should have been published along with the recovery plan. But let me ask you, are you confident now that the NHS officials and the government departments are broadly on the same page about the metrics that need to be achieved over the next few years when it comes to the backlog and many of the other aspects laid out in the recovery plan? Because I know from your thread on Twitter that it's about achieving those metrics and those targets that matters a lot to you.
Yes, I mean, so there was some interesting kind of speculation earlier on in the week as to why there was a delay in the plan. And I tweeted why I thought there had been a delay in the plan, which is, you know what happens when you draw up a plan is right when you get to the last moment, you agree all the final details. And what had happened has been that over the last 2 or 3 weeks, there's been a lot of hugely important work being done in precisely the areas we've been talking about, which is what level of metrics, how many of them, time commitments, but also levels of commitment against particular metrics. In other words, what percentage of, for example, cancer diagnosis would we get within the required target? That work was done at real pace, and it's been done really, very close to publication date. What then happens is, quite rightly, is there's then a debate around Whitehall, and there's an assurance exercise where effectively everybody kind of needs to sign off. And where we've got to is an agreed position between the Department of Health and Social Care, NHS England, Number 10 and the Treasury. And yes, of course you'd expect there to be backwards and forwardsing on that, because that's the nature of the relationship between the NHS and centre of government. And it's not the NHS controlling the rest of government, again, as your article implied. It's actually a process of negotiation and agreement between all of those different parties. And that's where we've got to. And the NHS is now very clear. We've been pushed hard, as we should have been, by government. We've pushed ourselves hard for the reasons I've explained. We do now have an agreed set of metrics that we will all now be working incredibly hard to deliver. And that's the process working as it should be. And if I'm honest, part of the problem here is that if you try and pick out individual elements of the process and say, hey, look at this potential scenario, here's a leaked document that basically says, some potential scenario planning, what you're not looking at is the whole. And I think it's perfectly reasonable for everybody who's taken part in those negotiations to basically say we've got to the most stretching and deliverable place that we could have got to given the context, and the NHS is now absolutely committed to delivering those targets, and we're absolutely if you look at all our frontline leaders, they are now ready to deliver what needs to be done, and that's how the process should work.
I think, again, looking in the round, looking at the fact that this isn't just about tackling the backlog, it's about the tax rise to pay for tackling that backlog, it's about all the decisions that have been made around COVID and delaying certain kinds of care. The forecast from which that whole plan is going to be jetted off from is one that potentially is going to be of interest to the public. And again, they can check it out in the magazine this week. My last question to you, Chris, then, is if you do think that, broadly speaking now, having sorted out the technicalities, that these government departments, Number 10 and the NHS, are roughly on the same page, do you think the tax hike, do you think the money that's going to go to tackling the backlog is going to be enough? Or are we going to see conversations in the near to medium future in which the NHS suggests it needs more funds? Or do you think this is now going to cover it?
Well, I think it's very inappropriate, and I've said this for 2 or 3 people over the last few days. It would be completely inappropriate for me, as somebody representing frontline NHS organisations, to come on and say, hey, the money we've been given is not enough, before it's even arrived and we've even started spending it. The point I have made, though, which feels to me to be an important one, is if you look at the long-term projections here, and I'll give you one example. The Health Foundation, a completely independent health think tank, is saying that we need 1 million more health and care staff by 2030-31 in order to provide the same level of care as we are currently receiving. What that basically means is we will need a discussion about exactly, over the longer term, mid to long term, about what level of funding the NHS needs to provide the right level of care in an environment where right the way across the world, and we're not unusual about this, the demand for care is rising. And this is one of the challenges that being in a taxpayer-funded system brings. There are lots of huge advantages. The equity is really important. The NHS is one of the most efficient systems, health systems in the world, and that regularly comes out of the data that's produced. But the question we will need to ask ourselves is, given the rising demand for care that every advanced Western economy is seeing, we will need to have the debate about, longer term, what funding does the NHS need and our wider social care system need in order to continue to provide the right quality of care. And to be frank, expectations of the quality of care are rising.
I do have to wonder if the forecast 8.5 million on the waitlist by 2025 will agree that the system is completely equitable, but we'll have to leave it there. Chris, thanks for joining me.